snow had sealed her son's eyelashes shut, and Nayeli was dying on her knees in a drift freezing, but she would marry the stranger kneeling beside her before the year was out, and her father's whole band would ride to his ranch. Her name was Nayeli, of the Mescalero Apache, and this was the New Mexico territory in the winter of 1878, when the worst storm in 11 years buried the high plains and nearly buried her with it. Stay until the end, because before the sun rose again, a lonely rancher named Gideon Marsh would learn that the woman he pulled from the snow was going to save him right back, and you will want to see exactly how a debt of life became a marriage. If stories like this move you, like this video and subscribe, because there is a great deal more waiting for you. Now let the storm begin where it always begins, without warning and without mercy. The blizzard had rolled down off the Sacramento Mountains 3 hours before dusk, and by the time the light failed completely, there was no longer any difference between the sky and the ground. It was simply white in every direction, moving so fast and so hard that a man could lose his own hands in front of his face. The old-timers around Tularosa would say later that they had never seen its equal. Not in 71, not in 65, not ever within memory of the territory. Cattle froze standing up against fence lines. A line shack roof folded under the weight of drift by midnight, and somewhere in the middle of all that fury, a woman was walking, because walking was the only thing left between her and dying where she stood. She had left the winter camp of her people 2 days before, on an errand of ceremony that should have taken half a day, carrying a bundle of prayer feathers and tobacco to her aunt's family, camped nearer the river, where an elder was failing, and wished to see them blessed before he went into the next world. Thomas had been fussy that morning, too young at not yet a year to be carried so far, but there had been no one else to send, and Nayeli did not trust an errand of that weight to anyone who did not understand what the words meant. She had gone. She had done what needed doing. And on the walk back, the sky had betrayed her. The storm came down so fast that her horse bolted from her at the first thunderclap of wind, snapping its tether and vanishing into the white before she could even reach for the reins. She had screamed after it once, uselessly, and then turned her whole self toward the only task that mattered. Keep Thomas warm, keep walking, find shelter, keep Thomas warm. She wrapped him inside her blanket and her own body, and she walked, with her head down and her eyes nearly shut against the ice needles the wind was throwing, and she counted her steps, because counting was the only way to keep her mind from surrendering before her legs did. By nightfall she had lost the trail entirely. She knew only that the wind was coming from what she believed was the north, and that meant walking into it would eventually bring her back toward the river, toward people, toward fire. She did not know how many hours that was. She only knew that Tomas's small body had gone from squirming to still, and that stillness terrified her more than any sound he could have made. Ta! She went to her knees twice and made herself rise twice. The third time, her legs simply would not answer. She folded down into the snow at the base of a jagged outcrop of rock that broke some small measure of the wind. Only to rest, she reasoned. Only for a moment. Only until her legs remembered what legs were for. She held Tomas against her chest inside the blanket and inside her own coat, skin to skin, because her grandmother's old teaching came back to her now. A mother's heartbeat was the last fire a child could borrow when every other fire had gone out. She did not know if that was true. She only knew it was the last thing she had left to give him. It was in that stillness, with the wind screaming over the rock, and the world reduced to white noise and white cold, that she stopped fighting, not because she wanted to die, because her body had run out of any other answer. Her eyes, when they opened at all, held no plea in them anymore, only the flat exhaustion of a woman who had already made her farewells and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Half a mile away, close enough that fate would later feel almost cruel in how narrow the margin had been. Gideon Marsh was fighting his own losing argument with the same storm. He had been 3 weeks working a line camp up near the Sacramento foothills, mending fence and doctoring winter-thin cattle for a rancher 2 valleys over, who paid fair and kept his curiosity to himself, which suited Gideon fine, since he had grown tired of questions a long time ago. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had built his own barn with his own hands, with a face that still carried more youth in it than the life he'd lived should have allowed. No gray in his hair, no permanent scowl carved into him yet. Just a quiet that sat over him the way snow sits over a field, covering something that used to be alive underneath. 3 winters back, a fever had come through the valley and taken his young wife, Sarah, in the space of 11 days, and the daughter she had been carrying with her. Gideon had built the 2 coffins himself because he could not stand the thought of another man's hands doing it, and he had not fully spoken more than was necessary to another human being since. His ranch ran itself well enough on discipline and habit. His horse, a sure-footed gray gelding named Ash, was closer to him now than most people, and Gideon was not ashamed of that, not anymore. He had left the line camp 2 days early, sensing the sky's temper before it broke, hoping to beat it home to his own cabin and his own stove. He had not beaten it. The storm had caught him a mile short of his gate, and he had made the decision every mountain man eventually has to make once in his life, that pushing forward was safer than standing still, because standing still in a blizzard like this one was simply a slower way of lying down in it. Ash was the one who saved them both, in the end the same as he always had. The gelding planted all 4 feet in a drift and would not move, ears pinned, nostrils flaring, refusing every command Gideon gave him, until Gideon, cursing, half blind in the whiteout, finally looked to see what his horse already knew. And that was when he saw the shape at the base of the rock. 2 shapes, small, unmoving. His heart did something inside his chest that he did not have a word for, something between a punch and a prayer, and he was off the saddle and running before conscious thought caught up with his legs. He found a young woman with black hair frozen into a solid sheet against her skull, curled around a bundle she would not let go of, even as he tried to lift her, her arms locked with the particular rigor of a body that has decided, without asking permission from its owner, that this one thing will not be surrendered no matter what else is lost. He peeled back the edge of the blanket with hands gone clumsy from cold and found the baby's face beneath it, lips a shade of blue that left no doubt how little time remained. He did not think about who she was. He did not think about the fact that her deerskin dress and the beaded moccasins on her feet meant something the men in Tularosa would have plenty to say about later. He thought only, "This child is dying in front of me, and I have a fire 3 miles from here." He tore his own heavy coat off his back, the same coat his father had left him, lined with wool thick enough to turn a blade of wind, and wrapped the baby in it before lifting him into his arms. The boy weighed almost nothing, a lightness that frightened Gideon more than any weapon ever had. Something moved in his throat, thick and unfamiliar, an emotion he had not let himself feel in 3 years, because feeling it meant remembering how it felt to hold a child who was his own and did not get to grow up. He turned back to the woman and held out his hand. She looked at it for one long, suspended moment. He would learn later that in that moment she was not deciding whether to trust him. She had already made that decision the instant his hands touched her son with something other than violence. She was deciding whether her body had the strength left to take the hand at all. It did, barely. Her fingers were solid ice inside his glove. He hauled her upright, half-carried her the last steps to where Ash stood waiting, and lifted her onto the saddle, settling the baby back into her locked arms once she was seated. Then he took the reins in his own numbed hands and began to walk, because there was no room on that horse for a third body, and because some things a man simply does not ask a horse to do, when the horse has already given him a warning once tonight? 3 miles. In an ordinary summer, a walk of less than an hour. In that storm, with the wind trying physically to push him backward with every stride, it became something closer to a war. He did not look behind him. He could not afford the doubt that looking back might invite. He kept his eyes on the ground in front of his own boots, and he counted, the same as Nayeli had counted, though neither of them would ever know they had shared that same small, stubborn trick for staying alive. Ash followed a half-step behind him the entire way, carrying his 2 passengers with a gentleness that seemed, to Gideon, almost deliberate, as though the old gelding understood precisely what cargo he bore and had decided, on his own animal terms, to be worthy of it. When the black shape of the cabin finally rose up out of the white, Gideon's knees nearly buckled, not from relief but from the simple total expenditure of everything he had been holding in reserve. He shouldered the door open, brought the woman in first, then went back out for the child, and laid him gently near the cold hearth before his hands. Shaking now from something that was no longer only cold, struck a match. The first flames took slow, then faster, then generous, spreading warmth into a room that had been holding its breath in the dark. Gideon worked in the particular silence that was native to him, stripping the boy's frozen wrappings, wrapping him instead in the thick quilt from his own bed, setting a pot of water to heat, cutting strips of dried venison and wild onion into a broth because it was what he had. And because a man raised on a ranch learns early that broth is often the difference between a night that ends in a grave and one that does not. Nayeli sat on the floor beside her son the entire time, never taking her eyes from him, and it was plain enough without a word between them. She would not eat, would not rest, would not so much as blink until she had proof her boy was going to live. He did not try to convince her otherwise. He simply set a bowl of the warm broth down in front of her, close enough to reach, and retreated to the far side of the hearth, putting distance between them the way a man puts distance between himself and a wild thing he is trying to earn the trust of, not corner. She did not touch the bowl for a long while. When she finally did, it was to lift it to her son's lips first, watching his throat move as he swallowed, watching the color begin its slow crawl back into a face that had been the color of old bone an hour before. Something in her shoulders came down half an inch, the smallest fraction of the weight she had been carrying since the moment her horse bolted into the storm. The night went on that way, the fire cracking, the wind hammering the shutters like something with fists, and inside an uneasy peace settling over 2 strangers who did not share a language or a people or any history at all, except the one they had just made together in the space of a single terrible hour. Thomas slept first, worn past resistance, his breathing slow and even in a way that would have been unthinkable 2 hours earlier. Nayeli did not sleep. She kept a vigil the way mothers do when their children have brushed close enough to the edge of the world to leave a mark on the mother even where the child heals clean. Gideon did not sleep either, though he pretended to doze by the fire so that she would not feel watched, feeding the flames at intervals, letting his thoughts turn over in the quiet the way a man's thoughts do when he has just done something he knows will cost him and has decided in the doing of it that he does not regret the cost. He was aware, distantly, that he had crossed a line that most men in his part of the territory would not have crossed. The tension between the settlers and the Apache bands ran old and bitter in that country, soaked into the ground the same as blood had been, and a white rancher carrying an Apache woman and her child into his own home was not a neutral act. It was a declaration whether he had meant it as one or not. He found, staring into the fire past midnight, that he did not much care. There had been a child dying in the snow. He had done the only thing a man with any claim to decency could have done. Whatever it cost him could be paid later. What he did not yet know, could not yet know, was that the silent woman across the fire from him was not simply a stranger from the winter camps. She was the daughter of Amaya Storm Eyes, a headman whose word carried the weight of the whole Mescalero band gathered near the White Sands Basin that winter, and that her survival, and the manner of it, was about to travel a great deal farther than either of them could imagine on that first long night. Morning came, gray and hesitant, filtering through the shutter cracks, in thin gray lines. The storm had spent its fury some time before dawn, leaving behind a world scoured white and strangely silent, the way land always goes quiet after violence, as if even the wind is ashamed of what it did. Gideon rose first, coaxed the dying fire back to life, and set about the small, unremarkable business of breakfast, moving with the same economy he brought to everything. Thomas woke not long after, his breathing full and easy now, color restored, and did what children do best. Regardless of tribe or tongue or circumstance, he looked around the strange cabin with open, fearless curiosity, examined the iron tools hung along the wall, and finally fixed his attention on Gideon's mustache with such evident delight that he broke into unguarded laughter and pointed. Gideon, caught entirely off guard, laughed too, a real laugh, the kind that reaches a man's eyes, the kind he had not produced in longer than he cared to count. Nayeli, watching the exchange from where she sat, felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched since the moment the storm took her horse. It was the first thing that had looked like warmth crossing her face since Gideon found her. She spoke then for the first time, laying her palm flat against her own chest. Gideon repeated it back carefully, as though handling something that might break if he got it wrong. She nodded, satisfied, and gestured toward her son, Thomas. They spent the morning building a bridge out of gesture and patience and the handful of trade words each of them had picked up across years of proximity to the other's world. Gideon learned that Nayeli had been carrying ceremony feathers to a dying elder when the storm caught her, that her horse had bolted and left her stranded, that another hour, perhaps less, would have ended differently for both her and her son. He felt something shift in his chest at the thought of it, not pride exactly, but a kind of vertigo, an awareness of how narrow the margin had been between the world as it was now, and a version of it where he had chosen a different trail home, where ash had not stopped, where the storm had come on 20 minutes harder. The whole weight of 2 lives had rested on inches he would never have known to measure. Nayeli stayed through the day, while the snow settled enough to be walked through safely. Gideon gave her dry clothing from Sarah's old trunk, a decision that cost him something private and quiet to make, though he did not examine that cost too closely, food enough for the trail, and saddled his second horse, an older mare, to carry her and Tomas back toward the edge of her people's territory. Before she mounted, she paused in the doorway and turned back to face him. She did not offer the word for thank you, not in his language, nor, as it happened, in a way that required translation at all. She placed her right hand flat over her own heart, held his gaze for a long, steady moment, and inclined her head. Gideon understood, with a clarity that needed no interpreter, that the gesture carried more weight than any spoken thanks could have. He watched her ride until the white distance swallowed her, and only then did he become aware of how much of himself he had spent on a single night, and how strange it was, standing alone again in the sudden quiet of his own cabin, to feel that the emptiness of it had somehow gotten louder rather than more familiar. News, in a country as thinly peopled as that one, does not travel, it detonates. It was old Silas Pruitt who set the fuse alight, a rancher with opinions as rigid as his arthritic knuckles, who had happened to be riding the ridge trail when Gideon passed below with 2 Apache riders on his horse 3 days prior, and who could not get to the saloon in Tularosa fast enough to tell it. Within a day, the whole settlement knew. Within 2, the whole settlement had chosen a side. Some men spoke of betrayal in low, ugly tones over their whiskey men who had buried kin or lost land in the long, bitter cycle of raids and reprisals that had scarred that country for a generation. Men for whom the line between settler and Apache was not a line at all, but a wound that had never closed. To them, Gideon had not saved 2 human lives in a storm. He had chosen a side, and it was the wrong one, and lines drawn in blood are not crossed without a price attached. Others were quieter about it. Women, mostly, who understood instinctively, and without needing it, explained to them exactly what it meant to hold a dying child against your own body in the cold. A handful of younger men who had not yet accumulated enough grievance to seal their hearts shut entirely, and the Reverend Elias Cole, who stood up that following Sunday and delivered a sermon on mercy with a fervor that left half his congregation shifting uncomfortably in their pews, but the other half sitting very still, listening. Gideon weathered all of it in the same stubborn silence that had always been his native language. He did not defend himself in the saloon. He did not explain himself at the mercantile. He rose before dawn and worked until after dusk, exactly as he always had. Honest in his dealings, sparing with his words, and if anyone looked closely enough, they might have noticed that something in his bearing had changed. Not pride, not defiance, but a kind of settled peace. The particular calm of a man who has looked a hard question in the face and answered it without shame. The cost came anyway, as costs do. 2 ranchers who had been paying him for winter fence work canceled their contracts without a word of explanation beyond a folded note left at his gate. He woke one morning to find 50 feet of his own fence line torn down in the night, a message with no signature attached because none was needed. Supplies went missing from his wagon box on another night entirely. Gideon was not a man made of stone, and each of these blows landed somewhere real. But he absorbed them one at a time, jaw set, and did not once let it show that they had landed at all, because to bend now would have meant admitting that the night and the storm had been a mistake, and Gideon Marsh was not prepared to believe that, not for any price the valley could name. The sharpest of it came to a head one afternoon at the mercantile when Gideon rode in for salt and nails and found Silas Pruitt already holding court to 3 other ranchers by the counter, his voice pitched loud enough to carry, plainly meant to be overheard. Pruitt not quite looking at Gideon, which was its own kind of insult. Man ought to know where his own kind stands. Ain't natural, taking savages into a Christian home. Man does that, can't rightly complain when decent folk stop trusting him with their business. The room went still, in the particular way a room goes still when everyone present is waiting to see whether a fight is about to start. Gideon set his coin on the counter, unhurried, and looked at Pruitt directly for the first time. That woman's boy was turning blue in a snowbank. Silas quiet enough that the quiet itself did more work than shouting could have. You'd have ridden past. I didn't. If that's the measure of decent folk around here, I expect I can live without the title. Pruitt's jaw worked, but he found nothing to answer that wouldn't have sounded exactly as ugly as it was, and Gideon collected his purchases and left without waiting for a reply, without slamming the door, without giving them the satisfaction of watching him rattle. It cost him something to walk out that calm. He would not have given them the truth of that cost for anything. He brought it up with Nayeli that same week, more from a determination not to let a wall of pretense grow up between them than from any wish to unburden himself. She listened with the same still attention she gave everything, and when he'd finished, her only answer was this: "Your Silas Pruitt sounds like a man frightened of a world getting larger than the one he understood. That is not strength. That is only fear wearing strength's coat." Exactly the right thing to say, Gideon thought. Exactly the kind of clear-eyed judgment he had come to rely on her for. What no one in Tularosa expected, what began to surprise even Gideon himself, was the slow current that started moving in the opposite direction only a few weeks later. It began small. A sack of provisions left anonymously on his porch one morning, more than he could have used himself, clearly meant to replace what had gone missing. A stretch of fence, the very stretch that had been torn down, mended overnight by hands that left no name and no trace beyond the neat, competent work itself. A neighbor who, instead of turning his face away as Gideon rode past, gave a short, unmistakable nod. It was as though the simple fact of Gideon still standing, still working, still refusing either to justify himself or abandon what he'd done, had begun quietly working on the conscience of people who would never have said so out loud. Slow the way a seed works its way around a stone, it cannot move straight through. And while that current moved through Tularosa a few careful inches at a time, something else entirely was gathering at the winter camp near White Sands, something that would arrive at Gideon's gate long before he was prepared for it. Nayeli gave the whole of that night in full before the council of elders, before the warriors, before her own father, the cold, the dark, the death closing in, and the stranger who had gotten down off his horse when every rule of that hard country would have counseled him to keep riding. Amaya Stormeyes was a headman whose name carried the particular gravity reserved for men whose judgment had proven sound across many winters. He heard his daughter's account to its end, without interrupting, his face carrying the practiced stillness expected of a man in his position, though those who knew him best could see something moving behind his eyes as she went on, something that was not quite pride and not quite grief for how close he had come to losing her, but some combination of the two of them entwined. When she finished, the lodge held its silence for a long moment. Then Amaya rose slowly, with the particular dignity of 60 winters carried in every motion, and gave the council only this: that man deserves to be known. It was Nayeli herself, in the days that followed, who insisted on more than words. She had her own voice in that council, her own standing as a woman who had survived what the storm tried to take from her, and she pressed her father and the elders toward a gesture that would carry real weight, not vengeance and not mere thanks, but recognition, the kind her people reserved for something that mattered. A small delegation was assembled within days. Deliberate, unhurried, dignified. They carried gifts chosen with care, a hand-woven blanket in the deep colors of the band's weaving tradition, ceremonial tobacco wrapped in soft doeskin, and a necklace of turquoise, the stone their people believed carried the color of sky and water both, given only to those judged true friends. They set out toward Gideon's ranch on a morning when the sky had finally cleared to a hard, brilliant blue, walking without weapons, without haste, without display, simply walking, the way people walk when the thing they are doing does not need to be rushed to matter. Gideon saw them coming from a long way off from his porch, and his pulse did something complicated in his chest. Not fear exactly, though fear was somewhere in the mixture, along with something that felt almost like hope, which frightened him more. He stood his ground, hands visible, body still, heart hammering. When Amaya Stormeyes reached him, he set the gifts down at Gideon's feet and extended an open hand. Gideon took it without hesitation. No great speech was made that morning. No treaty was signed, no vow spoken aloud for the record. Just two men standing in the cold, clean light, looking directly into each other's eyes and recognizing there something essential that needed no translation between them. It was Nayeli, standing a step behind her father, who broke the formal quiet with words meant only for Gideon. Her English was halting but clear, practiced carefully in the days since he'd sent her home. "I did not come only to thank you. I came because my father wishes to know the man who did this, and because I wish to see if the cabin still smells of wood smoke and dried onion." Gideon felt the corner of his mouth pull upward before he could stop it. "It does. I could put more onion in if that would improve your opinion of it." Something passed over her face that was not quite a smile, but stood very close to one. The visit that day was brief and careful, bound by the formality the moment demanded, but it planted something neither of them named, yet a seed with roots already reaching further than either was prepared to admit. Winter loosened its grip slowly that year, the way it always did in that country, releasing the land an inch at a time rather than all at once. And in the weeks that followed that first formal visit, something else began. Almost without either of them deciding it should, Nayeli began to return, first with her father's blessing on matters of trade, then on errands that required less and less explanation, until the truth beneath the errands became something both of them understood without saying. She came in early spring with baskets of the first wild onion and sage the thaw had uncovered, trading them for the salt and tools her people wanted from the settlement stores Gideon had access to. She stayed longer, each visit than strictly necessary. Thomas, growing sturdier by the week, took to following Gideon around the yard with the fearless devotion small children reserve for the first adult who is proven, in some bone-deep way, to be safe. Gideon found himself, in the quiet hours after she left, doing something he had not done in 3 years, thinking of a woman's face when he should have been thinking of fence lines and cattle counts. He fought it for a while, the way a careful man fights anything that threatens the fortress he's built around a wound. But a fortress built only to keep pain out eventually keeps everything else out too, and Gideon was beginning slowly to understand the difference between grief that protects a man and grief that has simply become a habit he no longer needs. Their conversations grew longer as her English sharpened and his handful of Apache words grew from a stammering handful into something closer, to real fluency, taught patiently, evening after evening, by a woman who found she enjoyed watching him struggle over a difficult sound. There is a particular kind of courtship that grows not from grand declarations, but from 1,000 small accumulated acts, a fixed hinge on a gate, she complained, squeaked, a bundle of dried meat left where he knew she'd find it before a long ride home, a rocking chair he mended without being asked because he'd noticed Tomas liked to be rocked in it. She in turn began leaving small things of her own, a woven cord for his hat, a poultice for a burn he'd gotten from the stove and tried to hide, a corn cake set on his table with no comment attached, simply left the way a person leaves something for someone they have decided matters to them. Neither of them called it courtship. Both of them knew exactly what it was. One particular afternoon stayed with Gideon long afterward, small as it was. Nayeli had come to help him salt a hide he'd been curing badly by her own frank assessment, and had taken the scraper out of his hands without asking, showing him the proper angle with quick, sure motions, correcting his grip twice before pronouncing his third attempt merely adequate rather than an insult to the animal that had died for it. He'd laughed at that, and she had allowed herself a rare, full smile in return, the kind that reached all the way to her eyes, and for a moment the two of them simply worked side by side in companionable quiet. The sun warm on the yard, Thomas chasing a lizard through the dust nearby, with the single-minded devotion of a boy who had found a worthy new enemy. "You are better with your hands than with your tongue," not unkindly, tapping the hide. "My tongue's had less practice. Wasn't much call for conversation out here alone. There is call for it now." Simple as that, and back to the scraping, while Gideon found himself smiling down at his own clumsy work in a way that had nothing to do with the hide at all. Another evening, she taught him the proper way to track a rabbit's trail through new snow, crouching beside him at the edge of his own fence line, with a patience she did not extend to much else, explaining the difference between a trail an animal had made moving and one it had made merely pausing to listen. Gideon found himself paying less attention to the tracks than to the sureness in her voice as she went through them, the quiet authority of someone utterly at home in her own knowledge. In turn, he showed her how ranchers read the marks left on fence posts to claim disputed water rights, a skill of no earthly use to her people, but one she absorbed anyway, turning it over the way she turned over everything new, testing its edges before deciding what to keep of it. It was on an evening in late spring, with the fire low and Thomas long asleep in the corner, that Nayeli gave him more of her own story than she had shared before, that her mother had died birthing her, that she had been raised largely by her grandmother and by the women of the band who had folded her into their own families without ever making her feel the absence keenly, that she had grown up strong-willed in a way some of the elders found difficult, and her father found, privately, a source of quiet pride. Of Thomas's father, a young warrior, lost 2 winters back in a skirmish with soldiers from the fort to the east, she spoke plainly, and Gideon offered no hollow comfort, only the steady presence of a man who understood exactly what it cost to carry a grief that had no undoing. You do not ask me to stop grieving him. Watching the fire rather than Gideon's face, I wouldn't know how to ask that of anyone. I haven't managed it myself. She looked at him then, and something passed between them that neither one rushed to fill with words, because some silences do not need filling. It was, Gideon would think later, the first night the quiet between them stopped feeling like the absence of something and started feeling like a thing in itself, warm and whole. In turn, he gave her Sarah, and the daughter who never drew breath, and the 2 coffins he had built with his own hands because he could not bear another man's hands doing it. He had not spoken of it aloud, in full, to a single soul in 3 years. Nayeli took it in the way she took in everything, completely, without interrupting, holding the weight of it with him rather than trying to lift it from him too quickly. Grief like that does not leave a long pause before the rest came. It only learns to sit beside the other things in a life, instead of standing in the doorway blocking them out. Gideon thought about that for a long while after she'd gone that night, thought about the fact that for the first time in 3 winters, his cabin had stopped feeling like a room he was merely enduring, and had started, without his quite noticing when, to feel like a place he wanted to come home to. There was a night not long after when Tomas took a fever, a small one as such things went, but small fevers in a country 3 days' ride from any doctor had a way of turning a grown man's blood to ice regardless of the odds. Nayeli had come to trade that afternoon and stayed when the boy grew warm and fretful, and Gideon watched her work through the evening with a competence that humbled him. Cool cloths at the wrists and forehead, a bitter tea brewed from something in her own gathering pouch, a low, steady voice that never once betrayed the fear. Gideon could see plainly in the set of her shoulders. He fetched water and stoked the fire, and felt for the first time in longer than he could say, genuinely useful to another person's crisis, rather than merely present for it. By midnight the fever broke, sweat-soaked and sudden, and Tomas slept the deep, boneless sleep of a child who has fought something and won. Nayeli sat back on her heels at last, and Gideon saw her hands were shaking. Now that the danger had passed, the same delayed shake his own hands had done the night he'd carried her and the boy those 3 miles through the storm. You did that, quiet, certain, whatever you gave 'em. You did that, we did that. She nodded. At the fire he'd kept fed all evening, the water he'd hauled and boiled without needing to be asked twice. A fire does not tend itself, cowboy. It was the first time she had called him that with real warmth in it, rather than the careful distance of a stranger's word, and Gideon found he liked the sound of it far more than he expected to. They sat together by the hearth the rest of that night, not speaking much, simply present in each other's exhaustion and relief, and Gideon understood, somewhere in that quiet, that he had stopped thinking of her visits as something to look forward to, and started thinking of her absence as something to actively dread. First shift, subtle enough that he could not name the day it happened, only that it had the trouble. When it came, arrived from a direction neither of them had been watching. A gang of horse thieves had been working the territory that spring, led by a hard case named Royce Tanner, who had a reputation stretching from the Pecos to the Rio Grande for taking what he wanted and leaving nothing alive that could name him afterward. They had been raiding isolated ranches and Apache herds alike with equal cruelty. And when word reached Gideon that Tanner's gang had been seen working their way toward the White Sands Basin, his blood ran cold in a way the winter storm had never quite managed. He rode for the winter camp the moment he heard, covering ground faster than sense generally allowed, arriving just as the light was failing to find the camp already stirring with the particular tension of a people who had caught wind of danger, and were choosing with a deliberate calm born of long practice. It was Nayeli, in the end, who first spotted the riders moving along the ridge above the camp in the deepening dusk, 6 of them moving with the unhurried confidence of men who believed the people below them were an easy target. She did not scream. She did not freeze. She moved through the camp with quick, low words, rousing the warriors, gathering the children and elders toward the rocks, where the ground gave better cover, doing, in calm minutes, what panic would have cost twice as long to accomplish. Gideon found her exactly there, directing an old woman and 2 children toward shelter with the same unshaken steadiness she had shown that first night in the snow, and something in him recognized with total clarity that whatever debt had existed between them from that first rescue, that the woman standing in front of him did not need saving so much as she needed someone willing to stand beside her while she did the saving herself. The fight that followed was short, brutal, and close. Tanner's men had expected an easy raid on a camp thinned by winter losses, not a defended position with a white rancher's rifle joining the Apache warrior's bows and the few guns the camp possessed. Gideon took a graze along his ribs from a shot that came within inches of ending everything, and it was Nayeli who dragged him behind the rock wall when his legs went unsteady beneath him, who pressed a folded hide hard against the wound with hands that did not shake despite the chaos breaking loose around them, who held him upright and conscious with a voice fierce enough to cut through the ringing in his ears, low and furious, her hands slick with his blood. You do not get to leave now, not after everything it cost to keep you. It was, Gideon would think much later, the closest thing to a declaration either of them had spoken aloud, and it arrived in the middle of gunfire, which seemed, on reflection, exactly right for the 2 of them. Tanner's gang broke and scattered within the hour, chased off by warriors who knew the ground far better than raiders passing through it, and Amaya Storm Eyes himself took the last of them down at the camp's eastern edge, ending. That night, the debt Tanner's gang would have gone on collecting from other camps had they not been stopped. Gideon spent 3 days recovering in the winter camp, tended by Nayeli, with the same fierce competence she brought to everything, and in those 3 days something settled between them that no longer needed careful gestures or slow accumulation to prove itself. The women of the camp came and went from the lodge where he lay healing, curious at first, then simply accustomed, bringing broth and dressing changes, and once his fever had broken enough for him to sit up and make a fool of himself trying out the handful of Apache words Nayeli had taught him, no small amount of good-natured laughter at his expense. He did not mind it. There was something in being teased by people who had decided, without much ceremony, that he belonged among them now, that struck him as a far better welcome than any formal speech could have offered. An elder named Nantan, who had lost his own leg to a soldier's bullet years before and walked now with a carved cane he'd made himself, spent an afternoon sitting with Gideon while Nayeli slept for the first time in 2 days. Through the halting bridge of the words they shared, the old man's meaning came through, plain enough. Courage was not the absence of the fear that had clearly been on Gideon's face in the middle of that gunfight, but the choice to stand inside the fear anyway, for the sake of people who needed him standing there. Gideon turned that over for a long while after the old man had gone, and found he agreed with it more than he'd agreed with most things anyone had put to him in years. When he was well enough to sit upright, Amaya came to sit with him by the fire, and the 2 men spoke for a long while of the raid, of the debt now doubled and repaid on both sides, and finally, carefully, of Nayeli. My daughter does not give her heart easily. She gave her first husband to a soldier's bullet and swore. For a long while, she would not risk giving it again. I know what that kind of vow costs to make, and what it costs to break it. Amaya studied him for a long moment, with the same weighing patience he brought to every judgment that mattered. Then you understand what I am asking, without my needing to ask it plainly. I do. And I intend to earn the answer, not assume it. It was the kind of answer that satisfied a headman far more than any grand promise could have. And Amaya rose, clasped his hand once more, and left the rest of it to be settled between the 2 people who actually owned the choice. Gideon returned to his ranch to heal fully, and it was 3 weeks later, with the ribs mended and the first real green of the year pushing up through the ground, that Nayeli rode to his gate herself, alone, without errand or excuse, for the first time since they had met. He was waiting in the yard, some instinct having warned him to be. She dismounted without hurry, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the whole spring afternoon holding still around them the way it does before something important is finally voiced. "I did not come to trade today." "I didn't think you had. I came because Thomas wants to know when we are going to stop pretending we come here for onions and salt." A ghost of that almost smile crossed her face again. "He is young, but he is not foolish." Gideon laughed, low and real. "No, he never has been." She grew serious then, the teasing falling away to something steadier beneath it. "My father wanted to know what I intend. I did not yet know when he asked. That was true then. It is not true anymore. What do you intend?" Something in Gideon's chest already knew the shape of the answer, the way a man knows the shape of a room he's about to walk into, even in the dark. "I intend to stop counting the reasons this should be difficult and start building a life instead, if you are willing to build it with me." Gideon crossed the small distance between them and took both her hands in his, the same hands that had once been frozen solid in his grip on the worst night either of them had lived through, now warm, now steady, now hers to keep for as long as she'd have him. "I have been building toward this. Since the night your horse bolted and left you to a storm, I still thank some higher mercy for putting me in the path of. I intend to keep building it every day for exactly as long as you'll let me." She did not answer in words. She placed her hand flat over her heart, the same gesture she had offered him the morning she first rode away, and this time she did not ride away at all. She stepped forward instead, and let him fold his arms around her the way he had once folded a coat around her freezing son, except this time there was no storm to survive, only a spring afternoon and a future. Neither of them had expected to want this badly. The wedding, when it came that summer, was neither purely his world ceremony nor purely hers, but something built new between the two, the way the whole of their life together had been built. Reverend Cole spoke words of blessing under a brush arbor raised by Gideon's own hands and by warriors from Nayeli's band working side by side without a single voice raised in complaint about who stood beside whom, and Amaya Stormeyes gave his daughter's hand with a turquoise band tied to Gideon's wrist, while Thomas, sturdy and laughing now, ran between the two gathered peoples as though he had never known there was supposed to be a line between them at all. Not every soul in Tularosa came around. Some grievances, planted deep enough and watered by enough years, do not fully dissolve within a single season, and Gideon and Nayeli both understood that some doors in that town would likely stay closed to them for a good while yet. But enough doors opened, the Reverend's chief among them, and Silas Pruitt himself, oddly enough, showing up at the wedding with a wedding gift and an unspoken apology in his eyes that Gideon chose, generously to accept without comment that the two of them built a life that held and grew, and did not need every door in the valley to stand open in order to be a good one. They raised Tomas together, and in time 2 more children besides, and the ranch that had once felt to Gideon like a room he was merely enduring became, in truth, a home filled with 2 languages, 2 sets of stories, 2 grandmothers' worth of wisdom passed down at the same fire. But Amaya Stormeyes visited often enough that his grandchildren grew up as comfortable, moving between the winter camp and the ranch, as they were moving between their own 2 names. The ranch itself changed shape around the life they built in it. Gideon added a 2nd room the following autumn, then a 3rd the year after, working alongside 2 of Nayeli's cousins who had, somewhere in the process of building walls together, stopped being her cousins in Gideon's mind and started simply being family. Nayeli kept a garden that mixed the settlers' corn and squash with the wild herbs she'd gathered since girlhood, and more than one neighbor's wife, curious despite herself, came around eventually to ask what she used for a fever, or a burn, or a bad winter cough, and stayed to talk longer than the errand required. Trust, Gideon came to understand, was rarely won in a single gesture, however large. It was one the way Nayeli had once mended his understanding of grief, a little at a time, sitting patiently beside the old suspicion until the suspicion simply had less room left to occupy. Thomas grew into a boy who moved easily between a rifle and a bow, who called Gideon by a word in his mother's tongue that meant something closer to steady father than the English word could carry, and who would, years later, ride the ridge trail above the ranch with his own children and point down at the cabin roof and tell them, every single time, exactly how his mother had once nearly died in the snow 1/2 mile from where they stood, and exactly how a stubborn cowboy and a stubborn horse had refused to let that be the end of the story. Years later, when their eldest daughter asked how her parents had met, Nayeli would tell it the same way every time, without embellishment, because the truth needed none. That a storm had once tried to take everything from her, and instead had given her a man willing to walk 3 miles through the worst night of his life, rather than leave 2 strangers to freeze, and that she, in turn, had given him back a reason to stop merely enduring his own life and start living it again. Gideon would only add, every time, that Ash deserved at least half the credit, and Nayeli would always laugh and agree that the old gray gelding had, in fact, seen the truth of things before either of his humans had the sense to. What began in a blizzard, with a mother on her knees and a stranger willing to get down off his horse, became something neither the winter nor the wary hearts of 2 suspicious worlds could ultimately hold back the plain, stubborn, unglamorous work of 2 people choosing one ordinary day after another to keep building a life neither one of them had ever expected the storm to leave them standing long enough to want.